In November 2015, 130 innocent civilians were viciously gunned down in a series of coordinated attacks while they were enjoying a night out in Paris. The assailants were primarily of Belgian and French origin, but a couple of those attackers were Iraqis that had somehow managed to carry out their attacks on America's oldest ally by taking advantage of the refugee crisis in Europe. Yeah? On this side of the Atlantic, the tides of refugee resettlement began to change more than ever. Of course, 2016 didn't go any better. The attacks continued. It's all so fresh in our minds that I can't even mention the names of cities like Orlando, San Bernardino, or Brussels without you knowing exactly what I'm talking about. We had ourselves a new hot button issue here in America, and people reacted harshly. The governors of 31 different states, Kentucky's Matt Bevin included, proclaimed they would not allow the resettlement of Syrian refugees in their respective states. Presidential candidates like Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush suggested only accepting Christians as refugees because they were not capable of carrying out violence. And a number of Islamic centers around the U.S., including right here in our city of Louisville, were vandalized by people blaming Islam for the world's terrorism problem. Eventually, this fear culminated at the close of the end of last year when America chose a presidential candidate who throughout his campaign promised to end the resettlement of Muslims in America. Luckily, for tens of thousands of families wanting to be reunited with their loved ones, he has been unable to completely follow through on his promises. But notice that I said he hasn't been able to completely follow through on his promises. That's because there's a caveat here. Section 5D of the infamous executive order, often called the Refugee Ban, has gone untouched by the federal courts. It is the status quo for how many refugees can be allowed to cross into our borders each year. It dictates that no more than 50,000 refugees, no matter what country they're from, can come into this country. Well, but 50,000 people, that sounds like a lot of people, right? Well, this is a 65% decrease from the previous year, which was 110,000 refugees. Yeah. Supporters of the reduction have maintained that 110,000 refugees was just too much to accept in 1 year. Absolutely exorbitant. But let's try putting this number of 110,000 refugees up against the total number of refugees in the world, which is 65 million. So you are telling me that the United States, yeah, the nation with the most wealth and resources in the country, is only capable of helping out 0.1% of all the refugees in the world? So you're telling me that countries that take on the bulk of this refugee resettlement crisis, countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Uganda, and Nepal, where the average salary is $3,500 per year, are better equipped to take care of this problem than we are? Okay, that's not the America that I was raised in. So perhaps Section 5D isn't as juicy as other parts of the executive order. Maybe it's not sexy enough to put on the homepage of CNN.com or Fox News. But it is the #1 threat to refugee resettlement in our country at the moment. Make no mistake about it. Agencies like Church World Service, which operate at home and abroad, are having to cut their services by 90%. Even in places like Asia and Africa, where there's virtually no threat of Islamic extremism. Local agencies around the country as well, very close to Louisville, and places like Wichita and Indianapolis are having to do the same. Fewer refugees means less funding from the government, which means less staff, which means a smaller dent made in the world refugee crisis. It's an economic do-or-die situation for us at this point. It's the real threat to the humanitarian work that we do for refugees. But here, in our great city of Louisville, a great Newtonian phenomenon has manifested itself. For just as many negative reactions there have been towards refugees and policies surrounding refugees, there has been an equal reaction in the opposite direction. It's what helps us enroll children in our fine public schools. And for a refugee coming from a camp in Africa, this is probably the first crack at formal education they've ever had in their life. It's what allows us to offer medical casework to an amputee or someone else affected by a terrorist attack. It's what opens up job opportunities so we can find refugees their first job, which is the quintessential way of integrating any immigrant into a foreign country. You, the community, is what keeps us going, and it's what I'm here to brag about today, is you guys. The negative, we all know it. I even probably harped on it a little bit too much at the beginning of this talk, but I just want to demonstrate the magnitude of our opponent that you guys have stood up against and will continue to stand up against. Our community has come through in some tried and true ways. The most obvious is through monetary contributions. People understand that everything operates around money. And as I mentioned before, the world refugee crisis is imperiled today because too few dollars are actually invested in it. But Louisville is a model city. And according to my coworker, Melissa Siegel, the donations coordinator at Kentucky Refugee Ministries, you all recognize this in a way the agency had never seen before in its history. In a recent conversation with her, Melissa informed me that in November of 2015, the community donated more than 50 times the amount of money that it had donated in the previous month. On top of that, she described how she came back from taking a few days of vacation, only to find her office packed with non-monetary donations that she had to climb over in order to get to her desk. We're talking diapers and home furnishings, everything. But notice that this surge in donations occurred in the same month that 31 governors, surfing the tall wave of fear in America, promised a Syrian refugee ban in their states just after the Paris attacks. Normally, I'm a little bit skeptical of correlations, and I'm always trying to find out whether they're false or not. But the letters that accompanied all these checks were pretty convincing evidence that people were lashing out against these politicians that they despised. Okay. The people rallied their support, and they even ended up creating a job for a refugee because we had to hire one of them to help us with the flood of donations we were receiving. But eventually, though, the number of donations, they kind of tapered off, but they still remained strong for some time compared to the pre-Paris figures. But this retreat in donation numbers didn't last long. Just 1 year later, with the election of the new president and his attempts to halt the flow of refugees into our country, the number of donations spiked again, and refugees again went home with enough strollers, with enough jackets, bikes, feminine hygiene products, work boots, you name it. John Kohlinger, the executive director at KRM, shared an almost unbelievable piece of information with me just the other day. After the Paris attacks, one person interested in helping out offered so much as a vacant home in Kansas to a Syrian refugee family. They said, just take it, we don't use it. It was unfeasible to make happen, but a remarkable gesture nonetheless. Again, it's Newton's third law of human group behavior, all over again. Or maybe Louisvillians will just go to any lengths to spite the politicians they disagree with. Whatever you call it, it's a great show of care and support from you guys. But after telling me about the nearly donated house to a Syrian family, John posed two questions to me that honestly seemed more directed to you guys than to me. John asked me, what about the support for the Congolese and the Somalis and the Bhutanese and the Burmese? Those refugees far outnumber Syrians in our city of Louisville. And in fact, they outnumber Syrians in all of the United States. John also asked, why does it take news headlines to incite us into action? These are valid questions that as a community so open to refugee resettlement, we must start asking ourselves. Imagine the level of quality services that we could offer if the support we've been receiving recently is sustained. But if you're anything like me, you barely have enough money to get by yourself, let alone help another family. It's a real dilemma, but there are ways to get involved. I sat down recently to talk with a young lady named Marissa Mason. I wanted to know what her job has looked like so far in her first months as volunteer coordinator at Kentucky Refugee Ministries. Marissa pointed out to me that when she started in October of just this last year, the number of people seeking to volunteer their services to refugees in the KRM office had been quite stagnant. But once the American people elected an opponent of refugee resettlement, Marissa saw her workload triple. The usual number of potential volunteers, which tends to hover between 40 and 50 per month, suddenly jumped to 142 in the month following the election. That's a lot of work for Marissa, and she is alone in her endeavor. But she had a smile on her face the whole time I interviewed her. Your community support might fill a refugee worker's plate, but it's never, ever going to make them sad. Volunteers are helping in a number of ways, she said. The most important way was by being a mentor for young refugees in high school, in college, or people seeking their first job. Or you could just be a friend. You could offer a ride or some emotional support to a refugee that needs prolonged medical services. Donating money to an agency is great, and it helps create a lot of great programs for refugees. There's no question about that. But true integration, creating an environment where a refugee has no questions about where their home is in this world, comes when we step out of our comfort zone and meet their hard work head on with our own efforts. If you are a mentor, there are going to be barriers. Conversation's going to be slow. As a good mentor, though, you should practice your Swahili, your Arabic, your Spanish, your Burmese every day as well. Smile, laugh, become a true friend to a refugee. Even if you don't have the time to become an official mentor with an organization like KRM, you can help out in ways that don't involve age-old methods of donating and volunteering. In fact, some of the best ways that our community is helping out is in completely unique ways independent of Kentucky Refugee Ministries. One important thing, though, to remember, if you want to help out, is to start off by being an active bystander. But hey, what's an active bystander? I don't know what that is, you might be saying. Well, it's pretty easy. An active bystander is the group of girls that stood up for a 5th grade girl from Somalia who nearly got in trouble on a school bus for not being able to justify exactly why she was lashing out against some bullies that were picking on her smaller brother. An active bystander is the person who sits and makes small talk at a bus stop with a refugee because that person knows that bus stops are the #1 spots for harassment of refugees in the city of Louisville. An active bystander is a parent who speaks up on behalf of a single mother from the Congo who is so concerned about her 3rd grader being bullied that she seriously thinks about never, ever sending her kid to school again. An active bystander is always informed about refugees and always shares the facts with those that they know. Stay informed, share the facts, Let that be a mantra for you guys. And once you've adopted the active bystander role, you can start to figure out ways that you as an individual can take something in your everyday life and turn it into a creative way to help out refugees. For example, the Highland Youth Recreation League, realizing that it had the wherewithal to help out, offered 24 soccer scholarships to refugee students recently. One man in the community who wanted to help out this cause created a GoFundMe page and raised $1,000 in just 24 hours. And every so often, one of several local restaurants in Louisville will have a Refugee Awareness Day, and they will allocate a portion of the day's profits to benefiting refugee services. The ways you can get involved are really infinite. It's up to you to decide what it is that you can offer to make our community stronger and more integrated. But I can't leave you guys today, though, without talking about the importance of refugee employment. I'm a job developer, after all. It's my particular specialty within KRM, and it happens to be the one thing that can get our federal funding cut if we don't meet numbers. But that's not a problem. You might be thinking, you just said, Eric, that you guys are getting tons and tons of donations, right? You guys are good. Well, unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. The tens of thousands we receive in private donations each year are peanuts compared to a few million in federal grants that we need just to scrape by and offer basic services to refugees. So essentially, if our community is incapable of fostering an economy that allows for integration through self-sufficiency, we're done for. So far, though, our employment office has done a pretty good job at meeting the desired outcomes. But with far greater numbers of Congolese clients with little formal education, work experience, or English, many business partners in our community are refusing to invest in these so-called tough cases. One of those tough cases is a single mother named Amy. She's from the Congo as well. She's been here for nearly 8 months in this country and has struck out on every single job lead. The other day, I grabbed an interpreter and asked Amy and 2 of her friends if they would just chat with me for just a minute. Normally, Congolese women are pretty quiet if you aren't a close friend of theirs. But I must have given them some air of confidence because they opened up to me instantly. Amy was the most outspoken, and she emphasized that her biggest desire at this moment is to work. Being idle and depending on government assistance wasn't enough for her family, nor was it dignifying. For all her children's life, she has provided for them. But recently, a new dynamic in her household has developed. Her oldest son has started working. If you know anything about food stamps, if someone in your household is working, your food stamps get cut. So this has forced the oldest son to now take care of her children. She pointed out that this has created a rift between her and her son, who, despite still helping out his mother, doesn't feel it's his responsibility to take care of her children. Without having to prompt her for more, Amy was quick to add how embarrassed she was to share this information with me. But she was willing to do so if it might help people understand what's going on with her and hundreds of other refugees here in Louisville. I looked at Amy, and she kept a strong facade after having just exposed her vulnerabilities to me. I could sense her exhaustion, though. She was just looking for a chance. The conversation continued, and our interpreter, David, shared a story about how he used to receive calls from a supervisor at a hotel. Another single Congolese mother had gotten a job there, and she was having a little bit of a problem understanding the nature of the job. So the supervisor was patient, David added, and after a couple of visits to clarify the job, the supervisor never again had to call him. That's because this woman learned the job. Amy approved of this behavior of the supervisor, and she wished for similar treatment for herself. Before thanking Amy and her friends for their time and saying her goodbyes, she spoke more of wanting to work side by side with Americans and becoming their friend. She envisions a day when Americans will bring their kids over to her house to play with her kids. They'll all get together and they'll all try their best to speak English, but if they have too many problems, she insists that hand gestures will work just fine. Sadly, though, the reality is that during the first 3 years in America, refugees develop virtually no meaningful relationships with Americans. This is why refugee workers like Marissa Mason are stressing the role of mentors in the lives of refugees. It's why my immediate coworkers and I, we seek out compassionate employers that realize that refugee workers, even though maybe they might get off to a slow start, will eventually catch up and learn the trade. It's why you in the community step up and makes a monetary contribution so that agencies like KRM can expand their services to include more quality services and promote integration. Hopefully, with all our efforts focused on meeting refugees somewhere closer to the middle of the integration process, we can get to know refugees like Amy. We can share coffee with her. We can laugh with her. And we can know where she's coming from. And most importantly, we cannot be scared of people like her ever again, because we'll be informed and we'll share our knowledge with everyone we know.